Hi, welcome to another episode of our Beginner's Guide to Web Design series. On this episode, we'll be looking at how to create ordered and unordered lists, how to work with HTML attributes, and then we'll be having a touch of CSS using HTML attributes. In case you don't understand how to work with CSS, you shouldn't worry yourself because in another episode, we'll be looking at how to write CSS code in our HTML. But in this episode, we'll just be looking at some basics of how to work with ordered lists and HTML attributes. Basically, ordered lists and unordered lists are used for listing items on a web page. So let's say, for example, you want to order a list of items, let's say names of people in a chronological order, for example, 1 to 10. You can use ordered lists to achieve that. Meanwhile, if you have a list of items that it doesn't matter how you list them, then you can go for unordered list. So quickly, we'll be creating a HTML file where we'll be writing some ordered list items and unordered list items, and then we'll see the differences between both, and then we'll be applying some HTML attributes on some HTML elements to see how attributes work in HTML. So quickly, let's create a folder for this and then create a file, and then let's do something basic. So in my desktop, I'll be creating a folder, and I'll name the folder HTML lists of items. Recall I mentioned in a video that whenever you are creating a project folder or whenever you are working on a project, you should try to name your folders with lowercase words and there shouldn't be spaces. So always try to maintain this practice whenever you're working on any project with HTML and CSS. The next thing is we're going to create a new file. Whenever you open your text editor or Notepad++, which we're using for our projects, you always see a new file. But in case you have a previous file that you've opened, you can just go to File, New to create a new file. But since I already have this blank page here, I'll just create a new file by saving it as index.html. I always recommend, but it's not necessary for this project, that you create the first file of your project, name it as index.html. I mentioned in the last video that it's very, very important because whenever you take your project live, your live server or your web server will always look for the index.html file as the first file to render when you visit a particular website. So we'll save this file as, we'll go to save as, and then I'll go to my project folder, which is on my desktop, HTML list items, that's the name of the project. And then I'll name this list items, list-items.html. Then I'll save it. So now I've saved this file in our list items.html file. Next thing I'm going to do is I'll just write some basic mockup. So that's some basic HTML code, which is the foundational code you need to write on every HTML file you create. Don't forget, the first thing we need to do is to create the doc type. To create the doc type, all you need to do is just have the left angle bracket exclamation, and then we'll write doc type. Doesn't matter whether you use uppercase words or lowercase words. So I have doc type, and then I'll have HTML, and then I'll close it. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'll create HTML tag, which is the root tag. Then I'll close the HTML tag like this. Recall I told you for any new tag you open, always write the corresponding closing tag. It's very, very important so that you don't forget to close some tags that you've opened. It's a bad practice if you do that. But take note also, there are some tags that don't have closing tags, but we'll get to talk about them in a future video. So the next thing is we're going to have our header tag, our head tag, and then I'll close the head tag. And then in between the head tag, I'll write our title here, and then I'll have ordered and unordered list. Then I'll close the title. And then outside of our head, I'll create the body tag, and then I'll close the body tag. Recall I mentioned how to indent code in a previous episode. If you haven't watched that, do well to check it out. It's just to maintain good code practice. So always indent your code to make it look neat. Now let's quickly create our ordered list and unordered list. But I'm going to write a very simple title at the top of our page using a H1 tag. Mind you, there are a lot of options when creating header tags because we have H1, H2 up to H6. So you can create a header using any of those tags. I would recommend you give it a try. Try creating a H1 tag, H2 tag, and see the differences. So when you're working on a project, you should be able to decide which header to go for. But let me give you a tip. Let's say you're working on a blog, or let's say a project or a news page, for example. You use the header tags based on the preference or the importance or significance of the particular header you are working on. So let's use a newspaper, for example. When you open a newspaper or a front page of a newspaper, titles that those news vendors want you to see the most, that's to stand out the most, we'll call it the H1 title. Why? Because it stands out the most. And then other relevant titles that are not as relevant, other titles that are not as relevant as the boldest or the largest that you see on a page can be categorized under a H2 tag or a H3 tag. So I'll suggest you create tags using H1 to H6 and see the differences. That way you'll be able to decide which one works for you. But in this video, I'll be using a H2 tag. So let's quickly do that. I'll create a H2 tag and then I'll put ordered list here. And then I'll close the H2 tag. So how do we create how do we create an ordered list? It's simple. You use a root tag called OL, meaning ordered list. You can see how simple the tag names are. So I'll close the tag like this. I'll say OL and then I'll close the tag. Now, what is common between OL and the next one we'll be creating, which is unordered list? You see something common between the both of them, but let's just quickly create this ordered list. So to create the list items, you use a tag called LI, meaning list, or the list items. So our list items, like let's say for example a book, and then I'll close this like this, and then I'll create another list item, and then I'll maybe a bag, and then lastly I'll create another list item, and then I'll write something like a pen, and then I'll close like this. So now you see that we have about 3 items in our ordered list. So let's see the outcome of what we just wrote. Make sure whenever you write or make any changes to your HTML file, always make sure you save it, because if you make any change, the text editor will always show a red icon on the name of the file, meaning that that file has not been saved. So we'll save the file. I'll go back to my project folder on my desktop, and then I'll double click on the file. I'll open it with my Google Chrome always, and boom, we have list of items 1, 2, 3, the book, the bag, the pen, all in ordered list. So basically this is how you create an ordered list. Next, let's create an unordered list and let's see the difference between the two. I may create the ordered list with the same list of items, but feel free to use whatever item you have in mind. So how do we create an unordered list? I'll create another H2 here. Mind you, you don't have to create a H2 on top of any list you are creating. I'm just using this to differentiate the two types of lists that we're creating. So I'll say unordered lists like this, H2. And then now let's create the unordered list item. How do we create the unordered list item? We use a tag name called UL. UL meaning unordered list. Then we close the UL like this, and then we start listing the item. How do we list the item? We use the same tag we use for ordered list, which is LI. So that's what both tags have in common, the LI. Whether you are creating ordered list or you are creating unordered list, you still need to use the list tag, the LI tag, to list the items in either of those lists. So quickly, let's create another list. Let's put something like I said, I may use the same items. You can use anything you want. So I'll use a pen, and then I'll close it like this, and then I'll create another list item. I'll have a bag, and then I'll create another list item, and then I'll have something like a book. So now I have 3 items on my ordered list, 3 items on my unordered list. So when we go back to the browser, I can just quickly refresh, and then we can see our ordered list and our unordered list. Now, can you see the difference between the ordered list and unordered list? The ordered list items have numbering from 1 to 3, and as many items as you have, the numbering keeps going like that. For unordered list, you just have bullet points. Okay, so that's basically the difference between both lists. Now, before we wrap up, let's talk about attributes. In HTML, attributes are basically a way of adding additional functionality to a particular tag, for example, or some of the things that a tag can do or have. And HTML tags varies with their attributes. I mean, attributes varies based on tags, while some tags share the same attributes. So let's look at a simple example of a HTML attribute. For example, on our h2 tag, we can create an attribute like this. How do we create an attribute? The name of the attribute, an equal sign, and a double quote, and then the value that the attribute is expecting. That's how you create attributes. So like I said, it's like you're adding an additional feature or to a particular tag or any tag you're working with. So let's work with the h2, for example. Let's give it an attribute. A common attribute that you can apply to a h2 tag is a title like this. Okay, and then I could just say is a header, and then I'll save it. Now, how does this title attribute work? When you go back to your browser, you refresh. When I hover over the h2 tag, you see that the attribute shows, the value of the attribute shows on my browser. This is the header. Now, I'm not recommending that every h2 tag or every header tag you create, you have to apply a title attribute to it. You apply attribute based on the need that they offer or solve for you. So you have to know when to use these attributes. But as we continue to work on more stuff, you get to see how attributes are applicable on your projects. But another interesting attribute I would like to introduce you to is the inline CSS attribute. That is, you use the style attribute or inline CSS styling attribute to apply CSS rules to your HTML elements. Now, I mentioned that you don't have to understand CSS in this video to be able to work with this attribute, because in a future episode we'll be talking about CSS from scratch. So whatever we are writing here, I'll just recommend that you just follow up with me, apply it, and see how it works. It's just for testing, and then in a future video we'll get to talk about how to use CSS. So quickly, let's work with another attribute called the style attribute. I'll apply it on my second h2 tag. So this is how it works. The name of the attribute, equal sign, and double quote. This is the format for writing every attribute. The only difference is for any kind of attribute you are using, there's a way you use it. For example, the style attribute expects you to write CSS in line. So a simple example of CSS is you use the color property. Like I said, you don't need to understand what I'm talking about here. I just want us to work with attributes and apply CSS using the style attribute, just to show or spice up the work we're doing here. But in a future video again, we're going to see how to use HTML and CSS. So quickly, let's apply some styling to our h2. I'll just write color, and then I'll give it red, and then I'll use a semicolon and then save. So when I go back to my browser and I refresh, you see that the second h2 has a red color. So basically, this is how attribute works. It enables you to add additional features or functionalities to your tags. I believe you've learned a lot in this episode. I will encourage you to practice whatever we've done in this episode. Create more list items, ordered list, unordered list, as many as you want. Play around with the H1 tags to H6. Play around with the CSS attribute we implemented here, irrespective of whether you understand what we did or not. And in future videos, we'll keep complementing and building upon what we've learned in our previous episode. See you on the next episode.